So the time of year has come around again where the Science Talks collaborate with UK TEPoP. And today is the first event of our UK TEPoP Autumn Festival webinar series. So we've got lots of people online today, not just from JNCC, but also from across TEPoP organisations. So hello to everybody. So for those of you who aren't aware what TEPoP is, it is the UK Terrestrial Evidence Partnership of Partnerships. It was created to bring together JNCC's partners who work in the field of terrestrial biodiversity surveillance and monitoring. So the organisations in the left-hand box there, and they are organisations that fund, organise, run and steer the terrestrial monitoring and surveillance in the boxes listed in the right there. So the underlying principle of TEPoP is one of collaboration and knowledge exchange with the benefit of enhancing efficient and effective joint working. Because lots of the challenges or opportunities relevant for engaging volunteers with monitoring one taxon are also relevant for other taxa. So it's beneficial in many instances for us to work together. So since TEPoP was founded 7 years ago, we've expanded the sort of official TEPoP network to welcome several other organisations keen to collaborate into our discussions. And I expect many of you are on the line today. So we've got lots and lots of TEPoP events planned this autumn. If you could move on to the next slide, Nikki, please, of which this is the first. So the next 3 events are sort of themed events with a mixture of presentations and discussions. And throughout the events, we'll be presenting work undertaken by the Terrestrial Surveillance Development and Analysis Partnership, which is hopefully all very relevant work for TEPoP. And there are opportunities to discuss the work further in the TSDA drop-in sessions in November. And then finally, we hope to see lots of you at a UKCEH event on inclusivity at the end of November, which I know is something many of us have been working on across TEPoP in recent years. So the 3 themed events require registration and are filling up quite fast, but we will be recording them for YouTube and writing them up. So there will be further opportunities to engage through the TSDA drop-in sessions and with those recordings if you want to. And if you have any further questions or information, do email us at tepop@jncc.gov.uk. So now we're ready to move on to today's event. We've invited 2 guest speakers to speak to you today to highlight how TEPoP data has provided evidence for invertebrate declines and the impact this has had on other species and potential solutions. So our first speaker is Dr. James Pearce-Higgins, who is Director of Science from the British Trust for Ornithology. And James will be answering questions straight after his talk. So please make sure to get your questions in before about 1:30. And we have a Jamboard, as I mentioned, for you to ask questions, which will be shared soon to use instead of the Teams chat. And each of the speakers today has a different page on there to put your questions onto. So I think without any further delay, I'll hand it over to James now, please.
So yes, I'm going to talk to you today about really insect declines, Invertebrate, as I've a slight corruption of an increasingly used term, birds and the biodiversity crisis. And I'm very much drawing on work that has been led by colleagues of mine, Ailey Barnes on the left and Blaise Marte there on the right. So the background to this is, I think, something that has been increasingly recognised amongst the ecological and conservation community, particularly kicked off this paper published only 6 years ago, flagging up large-scale declines in aerial insects from Germany, particularly from protected sites, over the last 2.5 decades or so. And since then, there have been a plethora of papers examining and looking at questions of insect declines since then. From my own experience, and as a child, probably I would have been, if I'd have had access to kind of digital cameras when I was growing up and much easier ways of identifying insects, I probably would have become more of an entomologist than I am. But I can certainly appreciate this as well from my time as a child in East Anglia. Species like wall brown and garden tiger moths were things I regularly encountered, but certainly now no longer see. But I think it's worth noting there have been other species that have increased as well. Willow emerald in the top there is as a species that's rapidly expanding and colonising across East Anglia since it first arrived in Suffolk in 2007. And some of our butterfly species as well, like the brown argus, is also becoming more common and widespread. So there's a pattern of kind of winners and losers, species that have declined and species that are increasing. And we know for some of our key invertebrate groups, like moths, there's large-scale declines in those from data such as the Rothamsted insect light traps, as shown here. But there's a mixed picture as well, and maybe that Francesca will talk a little bit around some of this. But if you look at the green line here, which is an overall kind of assessment of occupancy of insects going back to the 1970s from the Biological Record Centre, you can see that actually shows a bit of an increasing picture, although with a bit of a more recent downturn. And so there's a complex picture in vertebrate population trends in the UK. Some species have increased, some have decreased, and actually for quite a lot of others, we haven't really got a good handle on their population trends. And there's potentially a wide variety of causes of change, whether it's the loss of species associated of habitats and species associated with those habitats. Agricultural intensification has undoubtedly had a big kind of impact upon biodiversity in this country, or more recently, we think about there's concern over the impacts of light pollution on groups like moths. And also climate change is having a ubiquitous impact, for better or worse, across a wide range of our taxa. And what I want to talk to you about is then thinking about not just insects in their own right, but also the role that insects can play as underpinning really a lot of biodiversity in terms of the kind of keystone nature of many invertebrate species for many of our ecosystems. And this was first brought to light to me when I was undertaking my PhD on golden plovers in the Peak District, and one of the key things we discovered there was the importance of crane flies as food for golden plover chicks, and therefore the abundance of crane flies as a key driver of breeding success in any one year. Now, these crane flies have an annual life cycle, so they emerge as adults in May and June for a few days. They live as adults for a few days. They'll mate and lay their eggs in the surface of the peat, and those eggs will hatch later on in the summer, and certainly during July and August they'll exist as almost microscopic early larval instars in the surface of the peat, and they're extremely vulnerable to that peat drying out during that time frame. So if you look at the abundance of crane flies that emerge in any spring and correlate that with August temperature in the previous year, as you can see from this graph here, there's a strong negative correlation, particularly for the two peatland sites that are on this graph, which are the yellow triangles and the red dots. So when you get a hot, dry summer, the peat dries out. Most of the larvae, the tipulid larvae will desiccate and die, and therefore there's very few crane flies that emerge the following year, and that has a direct impact on the golden plover population. And actually, if you correlate population changes in golden plovers in the Peak District, and this is data started off from Derek Yolden's long-term time series going back to the 1970s, if you correlate annual changes in golden plovers from one year to the next with a measure of August temperature 2 years earlier, you get this strong equivalent negative correlation as well. So there's a really nice link between the impacts of warming on the insects and then on the birds that follow. And I think this is quite a ubiquitous phenomena that we need to be more aware of. And I collaborated with Roger Morris, the sort of leader, hoverfly recorder and an entomologist in this paper that we published in Bird Study last year, to really identify a number of key invertebrate groups where we know those are really important for driving population changes in birds, but also are potentially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Soil invertebrates, foliar insects, aerial insects, and aquatic insects. And here in this paper, we really call for much greater collaboration between entomologists and ornithologists to better link changes in insects, populations and birds, and to inform future decision making. So I want to just use three of these as to illustrate some kind of case studies really of how our understanding of what's going on with insects is helping us in terms of understanding changes in bird populations. And the first group I want to focus on is those soil invertebrates. And not only with my PhD, but also seeing patterns at the BTO like the declines in missel thrush here, which are very much apparent in the south of England. Species that rely very much on soil invertebrates like earthworms. It got me thinking about the what's going on with our earthworm and our soil invertebrate populations, which are not well monitored, and could that be a cause of these declines, these changes? So to start to answer that question, we got funding from EDF Energy to actually engage an army of school kids on the What's Under Your Feet project, which we ran for 4 or 5 years from during the mid-2010s until COVID put an end to that. So we had about 400 schools engaged in this project on an annual basis. And what we asked the children to do, and the advantage of using schools was it's a kind of common habitat, as it were, right across the country, to see if there was any large-scale variation in the abundance of soil invertebrates that perhaps could be linked to climate or soil type or features like that. So we got the school kids to dig up small squares of turf from their playing fields and hand sort those, counting the earthworms, the other soil invertebrates, measuring some of the earthworms, as you can see bottom right, to enable us to estimate biomass and look at changes through the season and in relation to a number of different factors. And a subset of the schools also counted the birds. What we found, and these data, the project probably engaged about 25,000 school kids over the course of the project. So fantastic from an engagement perspective, but also actually resulted in 2 scientific papers. So I think one of the most satisfying projects I've been involved with in terms of those children playing a real part in proper science, as it were. So what we found was that, unsurprisingly for any of you who are gardeners on the call, there were many fewer earthworms that they were recording, both in terms of abundance and biomass in June relative to October and March. And of course, one of the key reasons for that is that the soils are much drier in the summer and the earthworms go deeper and become much less available to, and that's obviously in the surface of the soil, and therefore that means they're much less available to the birds. And we found if you correlated that earthworm biomass with the number of days since it had rained, there's this strong negative correlation. So really providing a key mechanism by which drier conditions will reduce the availability of earthworms for birds like the song thrush, blackbird and missel thrush and so on. But on top of that, interestingly, we didn't find any evidence once you accounted for that rainfall parameter for there being fewer earthworms in the south than in the north. Then, as I said, what we did was we also had information on the numbers of birds using those playing fields too, that the schools had undertaken. And they counted all as many species as they could identify, but we gave them a kind of crib sheet for a range of different species. And interestingly, what we found was that the species which show associations and are known to prey heavily on earthworms, particularly the thrushes, and therefore for which earthworms were important in their diet on the right-hand sort of box plot here. They showed a significant association between the numbers of earthworms that were counted on the playing fields and the numbers of birds that were recorded on those playing fields. But other bird species which don't rely on earthworms, like wood pigeons, or that maybe only rely on them a little bit, perhaps like starlings, showed much weaker associations between the number, or no association between the number of birds and the number of earthworms. So really providing quite good evidence of the link that and the importance of those earthworm abundances and the use of those playing fields by these invertebrate eating birds, these thrushes. So although we found no evidence for fewer earthworms in the south and the north, that negative effect of drought, of hot summer conditions on earthworm availability potentially is enough to explain some of those large-scale patterns we see in some of our thrush populations. But this study didn't tell us anything about long-term trends. So as a follow-up, working with a couple of students from University of East Anglia initially, and then with Ailey, we wanted to try and answer the question as to is there any evidence for long-term changes in soil invertebrate populations, and do those trends vary with habitat? Now, obviously, we can't create a kind of monitoring scheme going back in time, but what we did was undertake a literature search to identify published papers where there was quantitative data on the abundance of soil invertebrates, and we were able to secure enough data to look at earthworms and leather jackets. So these were studies where we could pin the data down to a point in time and a location or multiple locations, and we extracted those data and attempted to analyze them with respect to is there any evidence of long-term trend and how do those abundances vary between habitats, whilst accounting for, as best we could, differences in methods, season, sample size, and so on. For earthworms, we had samples from right across the country, studies from right across the country, as shown with this map on the left-hand side, and the intensity of the colour indicates the number of samples from that 10k square, and the larger pink squares, 100k squares, where we've got secured data, but those studies were non-specific in terms of whereabouts those data came from. So we were able to often pin them down perhaps to a county, but not necessarily to individual locations. When we undertook analyses and put all those data together in the model, there was evidence for a significant long-term decline in earthworm populations, equivalent to about a 30 to 40% rate of decline in a 25-year period as a kind of standardized period of time. And interestingly, that rate of decline varied between habitats as well. So as we perhaps expected, there was evidence for significant declines on farmland. So these bar charts document the annual estimate of change from one year to the next by habitat. And surprisingly, much more extreme negative trends on woodland. There's less data from woodland, but it's still quite a consistent pattern. And then if we drill down into the more detailed habitats, there was evidence particularly for the declines in woodland to be greatest in deciduous woodland. And on farmland, there was evidence of declines on pastoral habitats, no evidence for declines on arable habitats, but earthworm abundances in those arable habitats were much lower than from pasture, and that is what we would have expected. That process potentially of conversion to arable habitats and the tillage associated with those we know will be damaging for earthworm populations. Just to round the picture off, we also looked, as I said, at leather jackets, so the larvae of crane flies, and much less data there, but there was no evidence for long-term declines in those through time. And I'm sure farmers would probably agree with that assessment. So we did our best to account for differences in methods and sample and studies and so on within this, but it is worth noting that these are not the results of a systematic monitoring scheme. We haven't got a good long-term monitoring process for soil invertebrate populations. So we can't be definitive about these results, but they are consistent with the hypothesis that earthworm populations have declined through time. And what would be really nice would be to either resurvey some of these sites or ideally to get some proper soil invertebrate monitoring up and running to look at things better into the future. But if these results are reasonably accurate, then this bar chart puts those declines of a 30 to 40% decline in a 25-year period in the context of other studies of other invertebrates in a UK context. Those are those other red bars, so declines in moths, butterflies, and small non-significant declines in aphids there from the Rothamsted data. And in the context of European studies looking at the aerial insects, so the Hallman study, moths, beetles, and caddisflies from, I think, the Netherlands. So they are of significance, and clearly given the role that earthworms play in terms of ecosystem structure and function, potentially biologically important. And we haven't looked at potential causes in this study, but clearly I think there's a good reason to think that a lot of things to do with agricultural intensification will have all been going in the wrong direction for earthworms, and also potentially climate change could have played an additional factor as well. And the reasons we were looking at this, it's easy to see how this could also have large-scale impacts on many of our bird species, such as the thrushes, which are in decline, particularly in the south and the east, as I've outlined, but also to some of our waders as well. And here's some interesting data on our winter populations of lapwings and golden plovers, which particularly during the 90s started to decline very much in inland areas, so places in the Midlands, particularly Nottinghamshire, which traditionally would have formed really important wintering locations for mixed flocks of lapwings and golden plovers, as you can see by this map on the right-hand side. If you then look at our more recent data, those have almost been sort of lost, and if you look at the atlas, our more recent atlas data, even more so, is that abandonment of these formerly well-used habitats because of a decline in soil invertebrates, for example. So clearly a lot more work to do there, but I think evidence that those changes could well be having a significant impact on our bird communities. So next, I want us to think about foliar invertebrates, and here I want to use the willow warbler as a kind of way into thinking about them as a group. Although I'm afraid in this bit of the talk, I'm not going to be presenting any invertebrate data. So the willow warblers are a long-distance migrant, winter in Africa. And if you look at our population trends, so these is kind of interpolated data from the Breeding Bird Survey, there's evidence of severe declines in the south, stable or increasing populations in the north. And this is partly down to reductions in breeding success. As you can see, there's been a decline in breeding success of willow warblers through time. And this decline and the breeding success is interestingly differs between the north and the south. So this scatter plot here plots data from an individual year basis, an annual basis. Each dot is a year, separating the populations in the south, which have declined, which are the black populations, so the black dots, where you can see there's almost no black dots in the kind of the top right hand corner, which is where there'd be high survival rate and high breeding success, compared with the data from Scotland and northern England, which are the white dots, where there's you can see a real cluster of points of high breeding success here. So we know that the problem in the south for the willow warbler is a lack of breeding success, and it's clearly a plausible hypothesis that could be strongly linked to insect availability. More recently, we've been able to come up with really good evidence linking willow warbler population changes and breeding success to temperature. Not only, as shown here, does the abundance of willow warblers and the population change of one year to the next of willow warblers from the breeding bird survey show this strong quadratic correlation with temperature, but also their breeding success as measured across Europe using CES constant effort site ringing data also shows a similar relationship. So what this means is that as temperatures increase, then warbler productivity declines. And this one factor alone is sufficient to explain part of the observed decline in England. So this graph on the left-hand side shows the observed decline in willow warbler populations in England in the black with the dots, and then modelled, as shown by this grey and this dashed line, if you account for that observed effect of warming. So it doesn't completely account for the decline, but certainly that warming trend accounts for about half of the decline in England. And the converse is true in Scotland, where you've got that increasing willow warbler population trend, which again we'd expect at least about half of that increase to have been as a result of warmer trends in Scotland. So things have actually got a bit better for them through time. But ideally, what we need is a better tie-in between our insect data, particularly on the abundance of aerial insects and foliar insects, and willow warbler productivity. And we're looking to do that, to collect some samples, to look at the diets of those different populations and see if we can better attribute those changes to insects. Finally, I want to consider aerial insects now and use the swallow as an example here. And this is work we published earlier on in the year, again using our nest record scheme, common bird census, and some of the Rothamsted's suction trap data on aerial insect biomass. This paper describes a number of different analyses. So the first thing we looked at was the factors that influence the abundance of insect prey at the time when swallows have got chicks. So obviously that's when there'll be potentially a critical determinant of breeding success. And we looked at this in two ways. We looked at overall annual changes in abundance of aphids and insects. And then we looked at the relative timing of swallow breeding and insect availability to see if there was any evidence of mismatch causing reductions in the abundance or the availability of insects for the birds. What we found, particularly because there's no kind of strong peak in flying insect abundance through the season, even though swallow breeding success swallow timing of breeding has become earlier through time, the main factor that influences the availability of insects for swallow chicks is just the overall abundance of insects in that year, whether it's a good insect year or a bad insect year. Hence this positive correlation with this arrow here. And there was no real impact of changes in phenology on insect availability. Then when we looked at the factors which influence breeding success, and we looked at the factors that influence clutch size, so how many eggs the swallows lay, and that was strongly linked to laying date. So actually, as swallows have nested earlier through time, that's enabling them to lay more eggs, slightly more eggs. We then looked at hatching success, and there are no effects of kind of temperature or rainfall or insect availability on those measures. But then when we actually look at the survival of the chicks once they're in the nest, we found a really strong effect of insect availability on that survival rate. And this bar graph summarizes those two relationships. So that negative relationship with lay date influencing clutch size. So earlier nests have got more clutches and therefore will produce more chicks. And also that positive effect of insect biomass on chick survival rates. So when there's more insects around, the swallows will breed better. We then finally looked to see if there was any evidence of this linking back to swallow population changes. And within the time frame that we were looking at, there was no strong overall evidence of that being the case. But it is worth noting that at the time of the data that we were looking at, which again was from the Rothamsted suction traps, the only data they had on aerial insect abundance was up until 2002. And as you can see from this swallow population trend, which goes from the breeding bird, so which goes from 94 through to 2021. If you look at 2002, that was before the swallow population was still increasing there. And there was only evidence really of insect declines in aerial insects in one of the 4 study populations that Rothamsted had covered, and actually in another population aerial insect abundance had actually increased. I know that Rothamsted are now extracting and looking at the data up until more contemporary time periods, and it would be really interesting to see if there's any evidence of a larger scale reduction in aerial insects since 2010, 2011, when we have really started to see this precipitous decline in swallow populations. And if that was the case, I think that would probably start to mean there was more evidence for there being a link between changes in insect populations and some of our aerial insectivores like the swallow. And it's worth noting that some of our other aerial insectivores like house martins and swifts are also in decline as well, although you've also got factors such as nest site availability potentially influencing them too. So just to conclude, I hope with those 3 examples, I've kind of illustrated how long-term declines in invertebrate populations are likely to impact on their avian predators. And by implication, I know I focused on birds, but you could probably say the same thing about invertebrate mammals or other key groups. There is building evidence, I think, for there being long-term earthworm declines, which would expect to have a multiplicity of impacts on the natural ecosystems. And that, I think, is also exacerbated by drought conditions in the summer, reducing their availability during those dry periods. Climate-driven declines in insects could have contributed to willow warbler declines in the southeast, or potentially interactions between climate and other factors that influence intensification or land use changes in the south and east. And I'm sure Francesca will talk about that in a little bit. And also we've got strong links between swallow breeding success and aerial insect abundance. And we need to see whether the more recent declines in swallow populations can also be, if there's any evidence for that being coincident with declines in aerial insect populations. But ultimately, what we need is improved insect abundance monitoring, and this is where the TEPoP schemes and the partnership that we see here is really important. And it would be good to think about what things like the pollinator monitoring scheme, for example. But I'm sure there's more that we can do as a community. And from our perspective at the BTO, it would be really nice to be able to twin more of that invertebrate data collection with the places where we've got bird population data as well, such as our constant effort site ringing schemes, to better strengthen that evidence between one and the other, because I think there's really good reason to think that birds are really good indicators of the health of our invertebrate populations, because they do sit at the top of the food chain. Now, for those of you who are entomologists on the call, and I noted Matt Shardlow is one of the people there, so I do acknowledge that I've just talked about birds as insects as bird food through the talk, and I apologise for that, because I do also recognise that there's many good reasons why we should be appreciating our insects in their own right, and what I'm talking about here have got significant wider implications, and I just wanted to make that point. So I'll just conclude there. Thanks to a variety of funders, including some of this work being funded by JNCC, RSPB and BTO as part of the Breeding Bird Survey development work, and happy to take some questions before I dash off to catch a train in a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, James. That was really interesting. Lots of interesting relationships that have been explored there. We have got lots of questions. I'm not sure whether we'll get through all of them, but we might be able to add some answers onto the end of the recording. But we'll start with one. Given the relationship between earthworm numbers in samples is strongly dependent on soil wetness, did you account for weather in your long-term trend analysis?
Not explicitly, but what we did was we accounted for sampling depth. So on the assumption that sites with shallower or deeper sampling and season as well. So sites with shallower or deeper sampling would be sampling different levels of earthworms, and also through the year. So we kind of accounted for the fact that you could be particularly picking that a negative effect of kind of drought in the summer, but not necessarily at other times of the year. So I think the results aren't just a function of those changes in weather conditions, but the one piece, there's a couple of pieces of work that we haven't done on the back of that analysis that I'd like to do. Firstly, to see whether there's any evidence of kind of spatial variation in those patterns, but also to actually identify, are there particularly sample years where you've got particular sort of declines apparent, and can that be linked to variation in the weather, as that's suggesting?
Okay, great, thank you. We'll have one more before I know you need to run off to get your train. So is it possible to derive some consensus from the available research literature on actions such as management that we can take to mitigate impacts of continued warming on different invertebrate taxa?
So I think one of the key things, at least for the invertebrates that are sensitive to soil moisture, is to think about our water management. So I started off talking about crane flies and peatlands, and we have done work there demonstrating the effectiveness of blocking drainage ditches and raising water levels. So that does then improve and increase crane fly populations by up to 3 to 5 times, and then will make those peatland systems more resilient to future warming. And similarly, in a lowland context, you can think of, and perhaps in a farmland context, what, in terms of things like earthworms, what I could well imagine is you've got interactions between maybe large-scale drainage for agricultural productivity purposes and then climate change. And those two things combine to really cause problems for moisture availability, which could also be one of the reasons why we see those declines in woodland as well. And I think where it would be really good to take the research and understanding forward is to think about actually what effect water management and soil hydrology can play in terms of helping to mitigate against some of those climate change impacts.
Okay, great, thank you very much. That's all we've got time for now, I think, and I know you need to dash off, but for everyone else who asked questions, we will try and put some answers to them in written form on the YouTube video. So I will say goodbye to you if you need to dash off, and I will introduce, thanks James, I will introduce now our second speaker, Dr. Francesca Mancini, who is an ecological modeller at the UK Centre of Ecology and Hydrology. And Francesca is going to speak about a recent paper that was published on invertebrate biodiversity. So I think over to you, Francesca. And remember to use Jamboard to ask questions. We've got another page for questions for Francesca. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nikki. I hope you can see the slides. Let me know if that's not the case.
Yep.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. So I will be talking about some work that I did with some of my colleagues, whose names you can see on the screen, on invertebrate biodiversity in cropland. So we all know that we are in the middle of a biodiversity crisis, and although it doesn't get nearly as much attention as the climate crisis in the media, it is a really big deal. We are losing species at an unprecedented rate, and we now know that increased conservation efforts alone is just not going to do it. If we want to bend this curve of biodiversity loss, we're also going to need a fundamental shift in our production and consumption patterns. Now, there's multiple drivers that might be behind these biodiversity declines, and climate change is obviously a big one and one that gets all of the headlines. But there are also other drivers of environmental change that might be behind these declines in biodiversity. One of them is habitat loss due to changes in land cover. So if we take England as an example, in a period of 25 years between 1990 and 2015, England has lost quite a lot of grassland, mainly because of the expansion of urban areas and woodland, plantation woodland. And obviously with all that grassland areas gone are also the species that used to be there. And another major driver of biodiversity loss is agriculture. Agriculture takes up a lot of space. Half of the total habitable land on this planet is occupied by agriculture. The majority of that is livestock, but it says 23% of that is occupied by crops. And so not only it takes up a lot of space, space that was previously occupied by a habitat for species, agriculture is also a major source of pollution. Obviously, we know about the emissions from livestock, but also in crops, pollution comes from chemical input, including the use of fertilizers and pesticides. Agriculture has changed a lot in the last few decades. After the Second World War, there's been some policy incentives to overproduce key commodities, such as cereal crops. And this has been achieved through the intensification of agriculture. That means things such as expanding the size of the fields and obviously getting rid of all the semi-natural habitat that used to be around those fields, but also changes in practices such as the adoption of large-scale mechanization, as well as increased chemical input, so an increased use of pesticides and fertilizers. Now, all of these changes had an impact on the environment and on the biodiversity in agricultural ecosystems. And once we realized what these impacts were, since the 1990s, there's been a really big push towards making agricultural production more sustainable. The symbol of this could be the introduction of agri-environment schemes, which happened in Europe around that time. And these schemes were quite successful at doing things such as reducing the rate of loss of hedgerows and field margins, and increasing the sort of heterogeneity of farming landscapes, basically, particularly through planting flower-rich habitat for pollinators. There's also evidence that these schemes can work for biodiversity. An experiment on a commercial farm done by UKCEH has shown that after 10 years of agri-environment schemes, a commercial farm was successful in substantially improving their levels of biodiversity for species such as butterflies and birds. But there's mixed evidence of the success of these strategies at a larger scale, so sort of national scale. Next to environmental agri-environment schemes, we also had more stringent regulations on the approval and use of pesticides and fertilizers, which sometimes has led to the ban of some chemicals. And generally, the toxicity of active ingredients used in crops has generally declined over time. So we're using less toxic pesticides, but their rate of application and their general use has actually increased. So we don't know where the balance is. So what has been the impact of these last 30 years of changes in agricultural policy and practice? We wanted to focus particularly on invertebrates because for different reasons. So the invertebrates, first of all, play key roles in agricultural ecosystems by providing important services such as pollination and pest control. But also, as you've already seen a bit in Ginny's presentation, terrestrial invertebrates particularly are not doing so well, and you've seen this graph already. So the and you've also seen all the headlines of Insectageddon, etc. Usually the picture is a little bit more nuanced than a headline result can ever convey. So in this case, I want to draw your attention on the comparison between the blue line and the red line. So the blue line is the invertebrate, the terrestrial invertebrates, which are showing a decline over the time period, while freshwater invertebrates are showing, after a really severe decline in the first half of that time series, a very strong recovery. So there's a lot more nuance. And some declines are particularly worrying. What you see on the right is the official pollinator indicator from 2022. And this indicator has been showing a decline in pollinating insects for a few years now. And obviously, this is very concerning because of the economic importance of pollinating insects for farmers, but also their very important role in feeding a growing human population. So we wanted to understand how terrestrial invertebrates are doing in Great Britain in general, but also comparing how they're doing in cropland versus other areas of the country. So we divided up Great Britain into 1 kilometre grid cells, and each of these cells were then categorised as belonging to one of three regions, a region of high, low or no cropland cover. So the cells that were in the no cropland cover region were the ones that had no cropland in it. Those in the low region had up to 50% of coverage of cropland, and those in the high region had more than 50% cropland cover. So we then used these data sets from these recording schemes and societies to quantify trends in the distribution of different groups of invertebrates. We particularly focused on bees, hoverflies, ladybirds, carabids and spiders because these organisms provide some very important ecosystem services in cropland, including particularly pollination and pest control. And we also included the terrestrial Heteroptera, which I will refer to as plant bugs from now on, as an example of an ecosystem disservice, as these organisms are crop pests. Now, I don't have to tell you how important these data sets are as a resource to understand how biodiversity is doing in this country, but you'll also be aware of some of the challenges in modelling these data sets. And this is because of the observation process, the sampling process is not standardized, and there's a heterogeneity in the way that the data is collected, not only across the different data sets, but also within the data sets themselves. So we usually use occupancy detection models to try and account for these biases explicitly so that we can reverse engineer the observation process and make accurate ecological inference from these data sets. Now, the output from these models are annual estimates of occupancy for different species, and we then aggregate those estimates at a taxonomic level. So what you see here is the average occupancy across the species for each of these taxonomic groups. Now, occupancy is the proportion of sites that are occupied by a particular species in any given year. So what these graphs are showing you is that there's quite a lot of heterogeneity across the different taxonomic groups. So groups such as carabids, for example, are much more prevalent in areas of high cropland cover than in the rest of the country, while for other groups, this is the other way around, including hoverflies and spiders, which are less prevalent in areas of high cropland cover. There is also a lot of heterogeneity in the sort of temporal patterns of change in occupancy. So for some species, such as spiders, for example, there's quite a slow and steady decline through the time period, while for groups such as the hoverflies, there's a more severe decline towards the end of that time series. So in order to compare changes in occupancy between the different regions of cropland cover, we calculated the annual growth rates, which is basically a measure of what occupancy is in the last year compared to occupancy in the first year. So if the annual growth rate is negative, it means that occupancy in the last year was lower than occupancy in the first year, so their distribution had declined. In this graph, each of the colored dots is a sample from the posterior distribution derived from the model. The grey dot and vertical bars represent the mean and 95% credible interval from the model. So what you see here is that overall, for the majority of these taxonomic groups, trends over time tend to be negative across the different regions of cropland cover. And even for those groups and regions, such as bees and carabids in areas of low cropland cover, where the trends on average are a bit more stable, there's still a significant proportion of the posterior distribution that is below zero. We also see that from the overall graph here, that trends in areas of high cropland cover tend to be more severe declines than in areas of low cropland cover. Now, we intended to use the no cropland cover as a sort of control, but I'll show you the map again. These areas of the country seem to be basically focused on in the north of the country, and they're particularly in upland areas. And that is just geography. These areas are just not suitable for cropland, so there's no cropland there. But that also means that they're not comparable to the other two regions. So from now on, I'm only going to focus on the comparison between the high and low cropland cover regions, which tend to co-occur a lot more in the country. So in order to test whether trends in areas of high cropland cover were different from the trends in areas of low cropland cover, we calculated the difference in annual growth rates between these different regions. So what you see in this plot is the grey dots are, again, the samples from the posterior distribution from the model, and the curves on top just visualize that distribution. The black dot and horizontal bars represent the mean and the 95% credible interval for that distribution. So what you see here is that overall, and for the majority of taxonomic groups, we find that annual growth rates in areas of high cropland cover are smaller, are lower than the trends in low cropland cover. And because for the majority of these taxonomic groups, trends in areas of high cropland cover tend to be negative, so declines, we can say that invertebrates are declining more strongly in areas of high cropland cover than in areas of low cropland cover. This effect was particularly strong for spiders, where the 95% credible interval did not overlap 0. And there was one noticeable exception in the hoverflies. Now, the hoverflies are the taxonomic group that shows the most severe declines. However, declines in areas of high cropland cover tend to be less severe than in areas of low cropland cover. So what can we conclude from these results? Well, we found widespread declines in terrestrial invertebrates across a range of cropland cover regions. So this is adding to the body of evidence that is showing terrestrial invertebrates declines across the globe. However, we did find large variation in the trends across the different taxonomic groups. And again, this confirms that the picture is a lot more nuanced than what the single headline result can ever convey. It is also not particularly surprising, given the variety of species and organisms that are within and across these different taxonomic groups. They all have different traits, different life histories, so it is not that surprising that they will respond differently to the same environmental and anthropogenic pressures. We did find stronger declines in areas of high cropland cover, and these declines, this effect was particularly strong for spiders, with the noticeable exception of hoverflies. Now, there might be different reasons why different taxonomic groups show different effects, and one of them might be how reliant the species within those taxonomic groups are on sort of resources that can only be found in semi-natural habitat. Spiders have a particularly high proportion of species that are particularly reliant on resources from semi-natural habitat, so this could be why spiders are showing more of an effect than others. But also, it is important to realize that this study is a very large scale and coarse resolution study. Data is at a 1 kilometer resolution, and we are missing quite a lot of detail in things such as what type of farming is going on in that 1 kilometer square. Is there organic farming going on, or are the farms in agri-environment schemes? We don't have any of that information, so it is possible that we are missing quite a lot of effects and nuance there. However, the results as a whole do tell us that the last 30 years of attempting to make agricultural production more sustainable in Great Britain have not been successful at slowing down or reversing the declines in invertebrate biodiversity in cropland. And we're hoping these results are send a message that what we have been doing so far has not been enough, and we really need to do more in order to support the resilience and the sustainability of agricultural ecosystems in the future. And finally, this study was part of the TEPoP project, which was funded by NERC. So I wanted to thank NERC for funding it. And particularly thank you to all the recording schemes and societies, and particularly the volunteers for collecting such an amazing resource, because without the data, this would not have been possible. And thank you all very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Francesca. That was, again, really, really interesting. We have a few questions coming in. I think one of them you answered in your talk because it came in before you were talking about the comparison between intensive low and intensity agriculture and high intensity. So I think you've answered that. There's a couple of people interested in how might we explain the difference in the hoverfly declines in terms of why they might be less severe in high intensity areas. If you have any thoughts on that.
I would love to give you an answer to that, but I actually have no idea. I gave this a similar talk a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, and it is someone was talking about actually differences in recording for the hoverflies that might be behind this difference in effect. But to be honest, I am not a hoverfly expert, so I really am not sure.
Okay, great. So any suggestions from anyone, then
yes,
let us
please.
know. It's a good audience to ask it to. Great. So another question, has recording effort increased over time, e.g. with more citizen science engagement, and how might this influence the trends, and are such effects controlled for?
Yeah, so the recording effort has definitely increased over time for all of these taxonomic groups, pretty much, for some more than others. The models have been tested for their ability to cope with sort of gradual increases through time in recording effort, and they cope quite well with that. They sometimes have trouble coping with like sort of very dramatic and very sudden increases, which is why we had to truncate the ladybird trends because they show a massive increase after 2017 when there was the release of a field guide, and they show a massive increase in recording effort that the model wasn't able to deal with, basically. So yeah, when the changes are really rapid and very dramatic, the models struggle a bit. But usually with the gradual increases that we see with most of the other recording schemes, we are able to account for that by having basically the detection part of the model changes through time with the air, and that is able to deal with that.
Okay, great, thank you. And the final, possibly challenging one to answer, this person will be interested to hear whether you think new agricultural policies like ELMS will be enough to address these widespread declines.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell at this point, isn't it? But I think we do have evidence that these things can work at sort of farm level, because we've tested it and we've seen that when they are done in a certain way. I think it's a question of, first of all, providing enough guidance to farmers so that they can do the best that they can do, because there's a lot of farmers that really want to help. But also, very often, I think what we're seeing here in this particular study at a larger scale is that probably the rate of adoption of these schemes has just not been enough for us to for those effects, those good positive effects at a farm scale to then translate into biodiversity is on the up at a national scale. So I think we just need more of it. That's at least a first step. But obviously, let's not forget that there's other drivers of biodiversity loss, including climate change, and it is possible that there's the interplay of these things just creates more pressure in areas of cropland, for example, where there are other pressures such as pesticides, etc. So it is a bit of, yeah, we need more of the sort of sustainable agriculture, and but we also need to look, take care of all the other pressures as well. And we need a sort of complex approach to this, because there isn't a one solution that's going to do it all. Also, I was just thinking about the hoverfly question. There is something about so some of the species, particularly the ladybirds and the ground beetles, that don't seem to be too affected by these areas of cropland. These species do tend to find, they are predators of crop pests. So they find quite a lot of resources in cropland. That's where they find most of their resources. So it is possible there's a lot of hoverfly species that are predators as well. So that might be a reason why, but yeah, again, if anybody's got any ideas, it would be really interesting to hear.
Great, thanks very much. I think we'll call it to a close there, and thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk, and to James, although he's not here anymore. But thank you both, and thanks to everybody who has come and listened today and joined in with their questions. And hopefully we will see lots of you at the next few TEPoP events, the next one of which is on the 30th of October about new types of recording. So thanks very much, and we'll see you all again very soon, hopefully. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.